Here begins videotape number 1 in the deposition of Leslie Matthews, MD, in the matter of Kevin Tolson versus St. Agnes Healthcare, Inc. et al., to be heard in Circuit Court for Baltimore City, Maryland. Case number 24-C-12-008071. Today's date, March 5th, 2014. The time on video monitor is now 1:08 p.m. The video operator today is Scott Pickering. This video deposition is taking place at Union Memorial Hospital, located at 3333 North Calvert Street, Suite 400, Baltimore, Maryland. Counsel, please voice identify yourselves and state who you represent.
Rodney Gaston, and I represent the plaintiff, Kevin Tolson.
Danielle Dinsmore, present on behalf of defendants Prudence Jackson, MD, Cruppershaw, PA, and Maryland Provo 1 Medical Services.
Mary Pat McGuire on behalf of defendant St. Agnes Healthcare, Inc. and Caroline Stell, RN.
Incorporated today is Linda Cole of Merrill Deposition Services. With the reporter, please swear the witness.
Do you solemnly declare and affirm under the penalties of perjury that the testimony you're about to give us today is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do.
Good afternoon, Doctor. Could you please state your name and business address?
My name is Leslie Scott Matthews, and my business address is Department of Orthopedic Surgery at MedStar Union Memorial Hospital at 3333 North Calvert Street in Baltimore.
Doctor, the reason that I've asked you to appear here today for your deposition is because the case that I represent Kevin Tolson with, it's pending in the Circuit Court for Baltimore City. The defendants have identified you as an expert that may testify at trial, and I'm here to find out all the opinions that you intend to give in this case and all the factual basis for your opinions. And I presume you've had your deposition taken before?
I have.
Okay. If at any time that I ask you a question that you don't understand, just stop me and ask me to rephrase the question. Otherwise, if you don't, we'll assume that you've understood the question and you've answered accordingly. Also, if any time you need to take a break, just let us know and we'll stop the deposition.
Thank you.
Doctor, I'm going to show you what's been marked as exhibit number 1. This is the notice that I sent to defense counsel noting your deposition today. Part of that notice contains a list of documents and items that we asked you to bring with you today. Do you have, and can you tell me what you brought with you today in response to the deposition notice?
Yes, I have brought a copy of my curriculum vitae and all of the medical records and deposition testimony that pertains to this case that I've reviewed.
Okay. Can you quickly go through and just identify each of the items that you have in front of you that you brought with you today?
I will do my best. I guess it's better to begin here. I have a compilation of files which include the medical records pertaining to Mr. Tolson's care, that include records from his initial visit to St. Agnes on 12/3/09, his follow-up visit to St. Agnes on 12/5/09, and his subsequent care at the University of Maryland, which began, I believe, on 12/8/09. So that's a good portion of these records. I also have a significant number of transcripts of depositions given in this case, including, and in no particular order, Caroline Stell, Krupa Shaw, Prudence Jackson, Dr. David Shank, Dr. Timothy Besant, Dr. William Woodruff, Dr. Paul Collier, Jeffrey Nicholson's deposition, who is a PA, Sharon Craddock, RN, Corey Elaine Tolson, Dr. Sarkar's deposition, Dr. Malik's deposition, 2 volumes of depositions from Linda Margison, RN, a deposition transcript of Gregory Sachs, CPO, a deposition of Kenneth Larson, MD. In addition, I have some CDs which represent the imaging studies that were done both at Mr. Tolson's initial presentation to St. Agnes on 12/3 and subsequently on his follow-up there on 12/5. I also have two DVDs of animations that were prepared for this case that depict or attempt to depict his injury and mechanism of injury, as I understand it. And then finally, there are just some correspondences that have taken place between myself and the other attorneys in this case.
Do you have the correspondence pulled out?
Well, it's here, yes, it's sort of intermingled, but
I'll just ask if at the end of the deposition we can pull them out and then I can mark them as an exhibit. But we don't have to do that right now, we can do that
whatever's
later.
best for you.
Okay. All right.
I believe that covers everything.
Doctor, I didn't hear you say that you reviewed an MRI study that was taken at University of Maryland Hospital on December the 9th. Do you know if you reviewed...
I certainly saw a written report describing the findings. I can't recall, quite honestly, if I actually saw the images or not.
Okay. Did you need to see the actual images for any of the opinions that you intend to give in this case, or did you rely upon the written report itself?
That had not seeing the images would not have any bearing on any of my opinions, I don't believe.
Okay. And did you prepare any notes?
I did not.
Okay. And have you made any notations in any of the records that you brought with you today?
I have not.
Okay. And doctor, can you tell me when you were first contacted to serve as an expert witness in this case?
Roughly sometime before the first of the year, I think in the month of December of 2013, if I'm not mistaken.
And which attorney contacted you?
I believe Ms. Dinsmore.
Okay. Have you worked for Ms. Dinsmore or her firm before?
Not with Ms. Dinsmore that I can recall, and I don't believe with her firm.
Okay. Do you know how Ms. Dinsmore knew about you? Or
I do not.
Okay. All right. And doctor, you're serving today as an expert witness in a medical malpractice case. Have you ever served as an expert witness in a medical malpractice case before this case?
I have.
And can you tell me when you first started reviewing cases with an eye towards serving as an expert witness in medical malpractice matters?
I probably performed some sort of medical malpractice review or expert testimony over a period of at least 20 years.
20 years?
Yes,
Has it always been in the area of orthopedic surgery?
it has.
Do you hold yourself out as an expert in vascular surgery?
I do not.
Okay. And can you tell me over the 20 years or so, how many times you've actually testified in court, either by videotape deposition or in person?
Probably not more than 4 or 5.
Were they in the state of Maryland?
Yes.
Or were they all in the state of Maryland?
There was a case that I recall that took place in the state of Florida, and I was asked to give video testimony for that case for the proceedings in Florida. That's the only one I can think of that was out of state.
Okay. And over the 20 years, can you tell me the breakdown, a percentage of cases where you've reviewed for the doctors or medical providers versus the injured patient?
Both reviewed and ultimately testified is by vast majority for defense.
Is more than 75%?
Probably.
85%?
I don't know. I mean, 80%, 85%.
And has that percentage stayed the same over the last 20 years approximately?
Yeah, the reality of the situation is for some reason I don't get asked to look at anything but defense work. So I don't get any plaintiff's work that comes my way, so it's just the way it is.
Okay. All right. And when's the last time you testified in court, if you can recall?
In court, several years ago, I can't be more precise.
And of the 4 times that you've testified in court as an expert in medical malpractice cases, do you recall the nature of the case and the opinion that you provided?
In general terms, the last case that I can recall testifying in court was pertaining to a alleged malpractice occurrence that involved in a vascular injury in the knee area following surgery.
Do you remember any of the other ones?
There was another case that went to court. This goes back quite a few years. Similar scenario. This was a vascular injury in the knee area following arthroscopic surgery. Could not tell you the exact time, or certainly not the names. There was a plaintiff's case that I became involved in that I testified in court on behalf of the plaintiff quite a few years ago that had to do with a foot injury, and that's probably as good as I'm going to do for you.
Okay. In the cases where you've testified, were you testifying with respect to the standard of care or with respect to causation regarding the injury itself?
I believe more standard of care.
And in this case, are you rendering opinions regarding the standard of care of any of the defendants in this case, or more on injury causation?
Objection form.
Explain to me what you mean by injury causation, so I'm sure I accurately
Which means
answer your
to-
question.
It means the nature, extent, and causation of the injuries that Mr. Tolson's claiming in this case.
Well, I can't rule out that I would provide testimony depending on the exact question that had to do with causation.
Let me ask another question.
Okay.
There are allegations that the defendants in this case breached the standard of medical care for the treatment of Mr. Tolson. There are no orthopedic doctors as defendants in this case. There's only one emergency room doctor, one physician assistant, and some nurses. Do you plan on giving any opinions regarding the standard of care for those defendants in the treatment of Mr. Tolson?
Yes.
Okay. Which of those providers do you intend to give standard of care opinions on?
Hard question to answer. It would depend on the question.
Okay. Here, see, the problem is this is the only time that I'm able to get all the opinions that you have in the case. So what I need to know from you is all of the opinions that you intend to give. Is it easier for you to simply go ahead and answer that question?
I'm just going to interject if I can help out. Per our expert designation, Dr. Matthews is going to testify as to standard of care on all of the ER folks, but it will depend on what you ask him because he's testifying from the perspective of an orthopedic surgeon who is called to consult in the emergency department. So he may have opinions about portions of the emergency room care, but not others.
Okay. Doctor, do you hold yourself out as an expert in emergency medicine?
I would hold myself out as an expert in the emergency management of knee and lower extremity injuries.
Is that from an orthopedic surgeon's standpoint?
Correct.
Okay. Do you hold yourself as an expert in the standard of care for physicians' assistants who see and treat patients in an emergency room setting?
As it pertains to their assessment and interaction with patient and physician relative to orthopedic evaluation, yes.
Okay. Have you ever worked in an emergency room?
Sure.
Okay. Can you tell me, other than an orthopedic doctor getting a call to go to an emergency room to evaluate a patient, other than that situation, have you ever worked in an emergency room as a physician?
Sure. I mean, throughout my training, we spent quite a bit of time working, on emergency room rotations in the emergency room full-time for a period of time.
Can you tell me when that occurred?
That would have been during my training, which was, late 70s, early 80s.
Late 70s and 80s. Is that through your residency or internship program?
Correct.
Okay. And would that be a rotation?
Yes.
As part of your residency or internship, you'd spend some period of time in the emergency room?
That is correct.
Is that the extent of the period of time that you spent in an emergency room as a physician, taking apart the orthopedic consultation aspect of it?
Correct. Since that time, my relationship would have been either teaching or consulting in the emergency room.
Well, what do you mean by teaching in the emergency room?
Well, we're at Union Memorial. We're a teaching hospital. We have orthopedic residents and fellows in training here, and I'm chairman of the department and residency program director. So I have a large teaching responsibility. So if an orthopedic resident is in the emergency room evaluating an orthopedic injury or patient, there would be an opportunity or a potential that I would be involved in the teaching of how to manage, evaluate, and treat that particular problem.
Okay, so, but your teaching activities do not extend to teaching general medical physician's assistants in emergency room settings, do they?
They can. We have a large number of physician's assistants employed here. We have a large number of physician's assistant students who rotate here for training, and part of that teaching responsibility can involve teaching those folks as well.
But can you recall where you have participated in that teaching of physician's assistants with respect to their duties and obligations in an emergency room setting?
Sure, as it pertains to orthopedic evaluation, yes.
Orthopedic evaluation, okay. Only?
Sure.
Okay. Okay. And do you do any classroom instruction?
Sure,
With-
yes.
Okay, can you, with respect to orthopedic residents that work in the emergency room, can you tell me how that breaks down?
Object to the form.
Well, I guess I can best answer that question broadly. Our teaching environment has multiple facets. There is a didactic component where there is classroom instruction in the diagnosis, evaluation, and treatment of a wide range of orthopedic conditions, many of which are traumatic in nature, many of which pertain to the lower extremity, and that teaching can also include our physician's assistants, either as employed physician assistants or as trainees. There are other facets. There's the patient-to-patient contact. There's the surgical training. There's other facets to the educational environment, but certainly the classroom didactic is a part of that, if that answers your question.
In the last year, can you tell me how many days or hours you spent in an actual classroom teaching orthopedic doctors orthopedic medicine?
Gosh, I don't know, 100, 200, quite a few.
200 hours?
Yeah, probably. Over the course of a year, is that your question?
Yes,
Yeah.
sir. Have you done any medical/literature research in this case?
No.
Okay. Do you believe that there's any particular medical textbook, journal, article, publication, or treatise that is reasonably reliable for the medical issues that are involved in this case?
Object to the form.
No.
Do you intend to refer to or mention any medical textbooks, articles, journals for the opinions that you intend to give in this case?
Objection.
No.
Can you tell me whether or not you rendered your opinions in this case before or after you read any of the deposition testimony?
Before?
Okay, can you tell me the opinions that you reached before you read the deposition testimony?
Don't speculate, only if you can parse it out.
I'm not sure how to answer that, quite honestly. I don't know. I don't want to make a list that's not inclusive, so I'm not sure how to best answer that question. Maybe you can ask it again in a different way.
Okay. You indicated that you did reach opinions in this case before you read the deposition testimony, correct?
Yes.
Okay, I'm trying to figure out what those opinions are.
Objection.
Objection.
Well, I guess in broadest form, I was asked to review this case, and my review initially focused on the medical records, not deposition testimony, to see if I had an opinion as to whether there was evidence of a breach of the standard of care as it pertained to Mr. Tolson's evaluation and treatment at the St. Agnes Emergency Room beginning on 12/3/09. And after reviewing the records, it was my opinion that there was no evidence of a breach of the standard of care in those records.
Okay, and can you tell me which medical providers are you talking about specifically?
All of them.
Okay, I need to be, okay, you're going to have to list them for me. Which of the providers do you intend to testify in court?
Well, I don't know I don't know if you want to go to the ambulance driver. Is that a provider? I'm not forming an opinion on that. So I don't know what you mean by providers. It seems to me, and just correct me if I'm wrong, that there are 3 individuals who are the main focus of this case. It is the initial nurse who evaluated Mr. Tolson, it's the physician's assistant who evaluated Mr. Tolson, it's the emergency room doctor who evaluated Mr. Tolson. Those 3 people seem to me, correct me if I'm wrong, to be the focus of this case, and whether or not any or all of them breach the standard of care as it pertains to his treatment and evaluation. It was my opinion that none of them did.
Well, I don't want to presuppose that anyone is the focus or non-focus of the case, but you've identified the initial nurse. Would that be the triage nurse?
Correct.
Okay. Physician's assistant, I understand her name is Shaw, last name Shaw?
That's my understanding.
And the ER doctor, last name of Jackson?
That's correct.
Okay. Did you reach any of the opinions regarding a nurse by the name of Weiss?
Again, if the names don't all stick with me, but again, I didn't see any evidence of any nursing deviation from the standard of care.
Do you know what role Nurse Weiss had in the treatment of Mr. Tolson? Can you tell me that?
I'm just going to object. He just said he doesn't,
I can't recall specifically.
the names.
Well, can you tell me what role Nurse Stell had in the providing nursing? Let me get the question out first, then you can object.
Yeah.
Okay. Do you know what role Nurse Stell had in the treatment of Kevin Tolson at St. Agnes Hospital?
I'm just going to object. If you have any specific questions with regard to the care provided of Nurse Stell, then Dr. Matthews can comment on it.
Same objection with respect to Daniel's comments, Ms. Dinsmore's comments.
You can still answer the question, Doctor.
Again, forgive me for maybe not having the clearest recollection of names, but I recall that there was a triage nurse. There was a nurse who became involved in Mr. Tolson's care after he was triaged and then admitted to the emergency room, as well as the evaluation by the physician's assistant, as well as Dr. Jackson. So those are the folks that I recall being involved. If I have the names confused or wrong, I apologize.
Okay. Can you tell me why you believe the triage nurse? No. Let me ask you another question. Have you ever worked as a nurse?
No.
Okay, I didn't think so. Have you ever triaged anyone in the emergency room yourself?
Yes.
Okay, and that's going back to 70s or 80s during your residency rotation?
Right.
All right. Can you tell me why you believe the triage nurse followed the standard of care for her treatment of Mr. Tolson?
Objection form.
I didn't see any evidence that she breached the standard of care.
Well, can you tell me what you believe she did that complied with the standard of care?
Objection.
She did what a triage nurse, in my understanding and experience, should do. She evaluated the patient. She made initial assessments as to pertinent findings. She provided a triage level for the patient and then got them into an appropriate setting for further evaluation.
Okay, and under the standard of care, what is the appropriate evaluation that was required of the triage nurse for the triage of Mr. Tolson in this case?
Objection.
To assess his general condition, to assess his specific complaints and injury, to make an assessment of the initial status of the injured extremity, to help facilitate appropriate x-rays and help facilitate appropriate distribution to an area of the emergency room where he could be further evaluated.
Okay. And for the triage nurse's appropriate assessment, what specifically do you believe she did to comply with the standard of care in her assessment of Mr. Tolson?
Objection.
She took his vital signs. She got a history from him. She had some interaction, I believe, with the EMTs that brought him there. She documented the vascular and neurologic status of his lower extremity. She helped facilitate getting appropriate x-rays. She assigned a level of acuity to him which determines the pathway that he follows through the emergency room. Those are all things that are appropriate in my view.
Okay. In performing an appropriate assessment of an emergency room patient such as Mr. Tolson, was the triage nurse required to note any deformities in Mr. Tolson's body?
Objection to the form.
Well, I believe she did make the note that there was a deformity, which I believe ultimately she meant as swelling in his knee. And I think that's, again, appropriate.
Doc, you can refer to any portion of the record you'd like to in your answers to my questions. But I note that the triage nurse only wrote the word positive deformity on the form. Is there anywhere where she wrote what part of the body was deformed?
Can I,
Yeah.
where would it be? I'd have to look at it again.
Sure.
2-7.
Objection to form and foundation, since there's no expert witness testimony on your side of the case that this has anything to do with any alleged breach in the standard of care.
It looks to, the way I interpreted this was that there are lines here on this form that correspond to certain anatomical areas, and in the area where it says skin, derm, etc., she wrote positive deformity, which I interpreted to mean swelling. So that's the best I can tell you.
In your opinion, did the standard of care for the nurse who did the triage require her to write what body part the deformity was on?
Objection.
No, and again, further down, she makes a note of left leg pain, leg trauma. I mean, it seems pretty clear from this record that everything was focused on the leg. There's no reference to any other injury, and I don't believe there was any other injury.
Okay. Did the standard of care of the triage nurse require her to write the nature and character of the deformity?
Objection.
No,
Why not?
because again, that's not her role. Her role is to triage, not to make a diagnosis or further assessment.
But is part of her role to indicate where on the patient's body there is an injury?
Objection.
Again, I think it's
Just
all over
ask
this
the answer.
record that she did. Sorry.
Was the triage nurse required to ask Mr. Tolson, how'd you injure your leg?
Objection to form.
Objection.
Again, I don't know that she did or didn't, but I would assume that when she has written here leg trauma at work, that there was some way that she gathered that information.
But my question is more specific. In your opinion, was the triage nurse required to ask Mr. Tolson, how did you injure your leg?
I don't know that she didn't. I don't
Asked
have
and
I don't have an
answered.
opinion on that because I don't know if she did or she didn't.
Okay, so you do not have an opinion one way or the other whether the triage nurse was required to ask Mr. Tolson the question, how did you injure your leg? Would that be a true statement?
Objection.
Objection asked and answered. This will be the third time.
No, it's a new question, Doc. You can go ahead and answer.
I'm sorry, now you got me confused, so ask me
Okay.
again.
You don't have an opinion one way or the other whether the triage nurse under the standard of care was required to ask Mr. Tolson, how did you injure your leg?
Objection if this question goes to mechanism of injury. Otherwise, it's been asked and answered. Go ahead.
Same objection.
Again, my understanding from looking at the record was that she obtained a history that he injured his leg at work and that was an adequate triage assessment for her to make.
Yeah, but my question is very, very specific. And if you don't have an opinion, just tell me you don't have an opinion. My question is, do you believe under the standard of care, the nurse was required to ask Mr. Tolson specifically, how did you injure your leg as part of the triage assessment?
Objection, asked and answered. Don't answer that again. His answer stands. Don't answer it again.
I need you to tell me why you're instructing a witness not to answer a question, because there's only 2 or 3 very limited situations where you can instruct a witness who's not your client not to answer a question. I need to know it on the record.
Because I think you're harassing this witness by asking him the same question over and over and over again, and I think your question is designed specifically to harass him. And for that reason, I'm not going to subject him to that.
Is it the triage nurse's obligation under the standard of care to ascertain the mechanism of a patient's injury at the time of triage?
No opinion.
No opinion? Okay. Did the standard of care require any of the nurses who provided medical care to Mr. Tolson to ascertain and find out the mechanism of his injury?
Same answer.
No opinion? Okay. Did the standard of care of the physician's assistant require the physician's assistant to ascertain the mechanism of Mr. Tolson's injury?
Yes.
Okay. And in your opinion, how was that accomplished?
By talking to Mr. Tolson.
Is it by, okay?
By history.
Is it by asking him, how'd you injure your leg?
That would certainly be one way to do it.
Okay, all right. And do you believe that the physician's assistant in this case did that?
I saw no evidence that he did not.
Was there evidence that they did?
Well, I believe there was some evidence in the record relative to what was written down, and I also believe that in deposition testimony that he indicated that that history was obtained. So I think so, yes.
In this case, were you aware that there was a ambulance report that was made part of the chart?
Yes.
Okay. I believe the initial report, initial documents I had, the report was illegible. Was that the same copy that you received initially?
I had an ambulance report that I could read. There was a handwritten one included in this that was illegible.
Okay. Right, Doc. And I'll show you.
I did see another one, and I, sorry again, as to where it was, I don't know. But
I'm going to hand it to you. It's
Okay.
exhibit number 2. And I'll ask if that's what you, does that help to refresh your recollection?
Yes, this is what I saw.
Okay. As part of the standard
Is this the same thing that was illegible? Is that what it is? It just
That's
doesn't
the
copy
legible
enough?
copy. Yes, sir.
But it's the
Yes,
same
sir.
copy?
Yes, sir.
Gotcha. Okay, thank you.
Yes, sir. My question is, for the physician's assistant who was supposed to ascertain the mechanism of injury, if there's a legible ambulance report in the file, do you believe a reasonable and prudent physician's assistant should at least look at the ambulance report to see what the paramedics noted?
Objection, form and foundation.
No, I don't think it's necessarily relevant at all.
How come?
Well, a number of reasons. Number one, a lot of times these reports may not be available at the time you're evaluating the patient. Number two, they may not be accurate. Number three, if the patient is able to give a history directly to the provider, that's going to be more valuable generally than is a report taken by a third party on the scene. So for all those reasons, I don't think it's necessarily valuable or relevant at all.
Do you know whether or not the ambulance report was available to the physician's assistant in this case while she was treating Mr. Tolson?
I have no idea.
When you say it may not be accurate, do you have any reason to believe that the information Mr. Tolson provided to the paramedics was inaccurate in this case?
Well, let me answer it this way. I have reviewed this record, the emergency room record, Mr. Tolson's deposition, and I'm still not sure what the mechanism of injury was. I don't think it's clear. And there's a lot of conflicting reports and ambiguity and uncertainty that I think is replete in this record. So I don't know what the mechanism was, and I'm not sure anybody knows what the mechanism was.
My initial question was, do you have any reason to believe that the ambulance report is inaccurate?
I have reason to believe that it could be inaccurate, yes.
And that is based upon what?
It's not what Mr. Tolson says happened, for example. He talks about a gate hitting him between the legs, very different than stepping in a hole. Again, there's enough ambiguity and inconsistency here for me not to know what's accurate and what isn't.
Okay, so then you are not, then would it be, I think you just said you are unable to give an opinion on the mechanism of injury in this case, is that correct?
Objection to form.
If I did say that, I don't know that I meant to. What I was trying to say is that I don't think there is a consistent and reproducible description of the mechanism of injury that would let anyone, not just me, but anyone with certainty know what the mechanism of injury was.
Okay. Does that include yourself?
I said including me.
Okay. And with certainty, that's within a reasonable degree of medical probability?
Fair enough.
Okay. All right. All right. Now, does your inability to opine within a reasonable degree of medical probability what the mechanism of Mr. Tolson's injury is affect your ability to give any other opinions in this case?
Objection to form and foundation.
No.
Okay. Now, what was the physician's assistant's duty under the standard of care when she accepted Mr. Tolson as her patient in the emergency room?
I'm just going to object to the general nature of the question.
Same objection.
The physician's assistant has a responsibility, in my opinion, to make a general assessment of the patient's condition and a specific assessment of the pertinent injuries for which that patient is presented to the emergency room.
Okay. And do you believe physician assistant Shaw made a general assessment and a specific assessment?
I do.
Okay. And what general assessment did she make?
Well, again, this was a patient who had single extremity injury, was not a patient that had multi-extremity injury, multi-system injury, was not a multiple trauma patient. The physician's assistant, I think, was able to make that assessment, and then as it pertains to the specific injury, made an assessment that it was a knee injury, that x-rays were appropriate, that the vascular status of the leg was normal, and those are all assessments that I believe were important and within the standard of care.
Was the physician's assistant in this case required to do a orthopedic evaluation of Mr. Tolson's left leg?
No.
Okay. Why not?
For a number of reasons. Number one, it wouldn't have mattered. It wouldn't have changed anything. Number two, they're notoriously unreliable in this setting. And number three, it would not have altered the treatment that was recommended and ultimately rendered.
Okay. If she had done an orthopedic evaluation of Mr. Tolson's leg in the emergency room, do you have an opinion what would be the results of that orthopedic evaluation?
It is difficult to say with certainty because, again, we know in retrospect that Mr. Tolson had a significant ligamentous injury to his knee. But we also know from extensive experience that patients presenting acutely after a ligamentous injury of their knee have a very unreliable and difficult examination, and it's not one that generally is of any value to any clinician, whether it be a PA, an emergency room physician, an orthopedic surgeon, whomever. So the assessment in the emergency room trying to examine a knee is painful to the patient. It usually does not change treatment and does not affect the initial management of that patient, and therefore it's really not of any significant benefit.
Then would it be fair to say that you do not have an opinion one way or the other what a orthopedic evaluation, if it had been performed on Mr. Tolson in the emergency room, would have revealed?
Objection to
No,
foundation.
I believe I answered that differently. I said that it would not have mattered.
Do you
So
know?
I do have an opinion, and it would not have mattered.
Okay. What would it reveal in your opinion?
Don't know. It's hard to predict.
That was my question. I'm sorry, maybe we were talking about two different things.
Okay.
Let's go back again. I want to be sure we get this. Do You don't have an opinion what an orthopedic evaluation of Mr. Tolson's leg in the emergency room would reveal? Would that be true?
I have an opinion about what it might have revealed, but I don't think but more importantly, I don't think it would have mattered in the management of the patient. So are we saying the same thing, or are we different?
Almost. We're almost there. More likely than not, within a reasonable degree of medical probability, do you have an opinion what an orthopedic evaluation of Mr. Tolson's left leg in the emergency room would have revealed?
Objection.
I think it is more likely than not that there would have been some evidence of ligamentous injury to his knee. He would have had some laxity evident in the knee. To what degree and how accurate that assessment would be, very difficult to say. But again, it wouldn't have mattered.
Okay. And doctor, I presume you know the signs and symptoms of a knee dislocation.
I sure think I do.
Okay. Do you believe that a physician's assistant such as Ms. Shaw should also be able to recognize the signs and symptoms of a knee dislocation for patients she sees in the emergency room?
Objection.
Well, that's assuming that the signs and symptoms of a knee dislocation are present, and in Mr. Tolson's case, I don't believe they were.
But back to my original question, does the standard of care of physician assistant Shaw require her to be able to know the signs and symptoms of a knee dislocation?
Objection. You mean one
In
that's
general, or as it pertains to this patient?
In general.
And just so we're clear, you mean a knee that's presently dislocated or one that dislocated and reduced?
Well, we're going to talk about both.
Okay. So you're
Let's
talking
talk-
about
let's-
one
let's-
that's still dislocated?
Let's talk about the signs and symptoms of a knee that is presently dislocated.
Okay.
Should physician's assistant Shaw be able to, or is she required to know those signs and symptoms?
Objection.
I would say yes.
Does the standard of care require her to be able to know the signs and symptoms of a knee that has been dislocated but has been relocated or going back into the normal anatomical position before the patient arrives in the emergency room?
Objection of foundation and form.
Certainly, it would, if signs and symptoms suggestive of a spontaneous reduction of a knee dislocation were present, I would expect the physician's assistant to be able to determine their existence. If they don't exist, then I would not expect them to be able to diagnose it.
Okay. And what are the signs and symptoms of a knee dislocation in a patient that has sustained a dislocated knee outside the emergency room, but the time they come into the emergency room, the knee has reduced and went back into its normal anatomical
It can
position?
be very difficult and sometimes impossible to make that diagnosis clinically. Okay? My experience is it's easier when the patient can tell you, my knee popped out and popped back in. No evidence that that history was ever obtained here. And if there is discernible vascular compromise to the lower extremity at the time of presentation, then one's suspicion of that occurrence would be raised. Absent that, absent a history of suggestive, absent a clear-cut mechanism of injury, then it's almost impossible and certainly well within the standard of care to not be able to make that diagnosis.
You've only mentioned one sign and symptom, vascular compromise of the lower extremity. Are there other signs and symptoms?
No, let me
that-
correct you, I don't believe so. I've said,
Okay.
You said signs and symptoms.
Yes,
I said
sir.
symptoms, patient tells you their knee twisted, that it popped in, popped out. Again, none of that present here. Okay, so that's part of what I did say.
Yes, you did.
Then I said, examination-wise, again, I've already testified that the examination of the knee itself is difficult and unreliable even in the most skilled of hands, not just a PA, but myself or another orthopedic surgeon who does a lot of knee work. So you have to rely on secondary signs, okay, like vascular compromise to have that level of suspicion, or an X-ray abnormality that might yield some indication of that happening. Again, none of those factors were present in this case.
We haven't talked about pain.
We can.
Is pain in the knee joint, can that be a
Well, there's not a single patient who injures a ligament in their knee that doesn't have pain. Okay, so pain is not a specific indicator for a dislocation of the knee, no.
Is it a general indication that could suggest a dislocation of a knee if a patient complains of pain in the knee area?
Objection to the form and your question.
Could it?
called-
Yes.
And the question
I'm sorry,
calls
excuse
for
me.
speculation.
Same objections.
But a patient who's had a ligament injury that never dislocated could have an equal or greater amount of pain. So it's a very non-specific, not helpful relative to this diagnosis of a dislocation.
Well, let me ask the question in a different way. If a physician's assistant or doctor suspects that a patient may have a dislocated knee based upon the history that's given, what should the physician's assistant or doctor be looking for in the area of the knee in order to rule in or rule out a dislocated knee?
Objection.
I don't think there's anything, if I'm understanding your question correctly, there's anything that they can do in actually evaluating the knee by physical examination that would rule that diagnosis in or out with conclusive results.
And conclusive, we're talking about more likely than not within the field of medicine.
Correct.
Okay. Then if a physician's assistant cannot conclusively rule in or rule out a diagnosis of a dislocated knee by evaluating the knee, how is it done? How would they do that?
By either secondary signs that could be associated with a dislocation, such as vascular compromise, or by going to additional imaging studies, such as an MRI of the knee.
Would a vascular compromise include a cold foot?
Could.
Would vascular compromise include a numb foot?
Could.
And if a patient has a cold or numb foot, is that one, we said that could be one of the signs of a vascular compromise. If that was present in a patient, that a physician assistant or a doctor was examining in the emergency room, that it sustained a traumatic injury to the knee, what else could that doctor do for the patient? What other additional tests could the doctor order to determine if there was a vascular compromise?
Okay, where they suspect it's, the signs and symptoms are from a vascular compromise, is that what you're saying?
Doctor,
I'm
did you-
objecting to the foundation in the form, because you didn't specify whether
Did you
they-
understand the
Are we
question?
talking a hypothetical here? Is that what we're talking?
Right. Mhm.
Where they suspect there's a vascular compromise.
No, my question is, for a patient that has a traumatic injury to the knee, where upon examination, the patient's foot is cold and numb to the touch, which you said could be signs of a vascular compromise. If the doctor, physician's assistant, suspected it may be signs of a vascular
Okay.
compromise,
Okay.
what else could they do?
Well, I would answer that a number of ways. A cold, numb foot is not enough indication in and of itself. One would have to also assess presence or absence of pulses, presence or absence of motor function, the environment where the patient came from, a number of other factors. But if all of those things together suggested that there was a vascular compromise, then there would be a number of other potential tests that could be obtained, including a vascular consultation, ankle brachial index, an arteriogram, an MRI. I mean, there's a number of tests that could be done, but that body of evidence would have to be present to justify proceeding to those types of tests.
Lack of motor function, would that be an inability to move a joint?
Or a portion of a joint, sure.
With respect to the action taken by physician assistant Shaw, what was she supposed to do under the standard of care based upon her examination of Mr. Tolson?
Objection to form and foundation.
Well, as it pertains to the extremity, I think to recognize that there was the potential or existence of a ligamentous injury to the knee, to obtain appropriate x-rays to make sure there was no apparent fracture or dislocation or other abnormality that would alter treatment, to assess the vascular status and viability of the extremity, to obviously consult and involve a physician in the ultimate decision-making and treatment plan, and then to provide adequate immobilization for that injured knee pending further evaluation by an orthopedic surgeon.
Was physician assistant Shaw required to remove the splint off of Mr. Tolson's leg in order to perform her examination?
Objection.
No.
Objection.
Why not?
Well, for two reasons. Number one, the splint is there for a purpose, which is to provide support, pain relief, and protection for the joint. We've already said that a ligamentous exam, or as you refer to it, an orthopedic exam of the patient's knee is not going to be helpful or reliable. And once x-rays are able to be obtained adequately, there's nothing else that removing the splint would add.
So, if physician assistant Shaw was not required to perform an orthopedic evaluation of Mr. Tolson's leg, was the only thing she required to do was to see whether or not there was a vascular compromise?
Objection.
No, as I said, there were other things that were, I believe, done in terms of the overall assessment of the patient, stability of vital signs, absence of other injury, patient able to communicate. Certainly assessing the vascular status of the leg was one of the more important ones. Also obtaining x-rays and evaluating those x-rays. So I think there were a number of other functions that were performed here that were appropriate. But for P.A. Shaw to remove a splint and attempt to make some manual examination of Mr. Tolson's knee would have been, as I've said before, unreliable, unhelpful, and possibly even detrimental.
Okay. Do you know how she reached the conclusion that Mr. Tolson did not have full range of motion with respect to his knee if she didn't remove the knee splint and put his knee through some range of motion testing?
I'm going to object to the form and foundation and the hypothetical. Are you asserting she didn't remove the splint? Do you know, one way or the other?
I'm asking the doctor the question.
Well, the way you asked it assumes that there was a splint she didn't remove.
Well, there's just to be clear, and I'm not, I guess to answer your question, you could not assess range of motion with a splint on.
Okay, that's a fair question,
does
doctor.
that
That's a fair
answer your question?
Yes, sir, it does. Okay. If you want to perform a range of motion testing for a patient such as Mr. Tolson, who is in an extreme amount of pain, in order to determine whether he does have ligamentous injuries, is there some type of analgesic medicine that can be injected into the knee in order to reduce the pain, to allow a doctor to perform a range of motion testing without putting the patient through more pain?
Objection to form and foundation.
Objection.
Well, let me take your question in a couple ways. You seem to be associating range of motion with ligamentous testing. They're different. They're not the same thing. So it's possible to perform ligamentous testing without range of motion. It's possible to perform range of motion without ligamentous testing. So those are not the same things. They're two different things. In either case, whether it be range of motion or ligamentous testing, I have said and will say again, I think it was irrelevant in the evaluation and treatment and planning for Mr. Tolson.
Right, but it didn't answer my question. My question was, if a doctor wanted to perform either ligamentous
Sorry, you're
test...
right, I forgot that.
If the doctor wanted to perform, or a physician assistant wanted to perform ligamentous testing or range of motion testing on a patient who was in a significant amount of pain, like Mr. Tolson, is there some type of analgesic that the doctor could inject into the leg in order to reduce the pain to facilitate that examination?
I think his problem is you're asking a compound question. You said range of motion or ligamentous exam, which he just said is two different things.
Right, I want to know both.
So it's a compound question.
Exactly.
There is a technique that has been described of injecting local anesthetic in the knee to try to facilitate the examination. My experience has been it doesn't work, it's not helpful, it generally is worse rather than better, it raises the risk of infection, and it's not something we teach, we recommend, or we do. So to answer your question, it's out there as a description. From a practical experience, it's of no value.
Is your opinion that physician assistant Shaw did not have to perform a orthopedic evaluation of his knee because Mr. Tolson was in pain, or because you believe it would have been unreliable and have no benefit with respect to the treatment that was about to be rendered?
Both.
Objection to form.
Both. Okay. Now, if the pain was zero, would your opinion still be the same, that the physician's assistant and/or doctor was not required under the standard of care to perform either a range of motion testing or ligamentous testing of Mr. Tolson's knee when he was in the emergency room?
Objection to
Yes.
form in the hypothetical.
Okay. Is it
Sorry, do I need to be waiting? I apologize.
Yeah, it's okay.
Is it for the same reasons that you did not believe that that examination would have been either reliable and would have been no benefit for the diagnosis and treatment rendered to the patient?
Object to form.
Under your hypothetical, with zero pain, the exam would be more reliable, not totally reliable, but more reliable than is the normal case where there is some level of pain. But again, more importantly, it doesn't affect the initial treatment of the patient in the emergency room. So if he has a little bit of laxity in his knee or a little more laxity in his knee on exam, depending on how well you examine him, how comfortable he is, it doesn't change a thing.
Okay. With a patient such as Mr. Tolson, he suffered severe ligamentous injuries when the gate struck him.
Is that what happened, that the gate struck him?
They got caught up in the gate. Yeah, the gate, maybe no one's told you what happened.
I couldn't tell from the record.
And
I'm being honest with you.
I'll explain it to you. Maybe it'll help you understand a little bit better. At the facility where he's at, they have a steel gate that consists of steel cables, and it lays down in the ground in a recessed area. And as with most federal facilities after 9/11, if they suspect someone's going to breach the perimeter with a vehicle, they push a button and the gate springs up and catches the vehicle and prevents the vehicle from going in. The gate was down, he was walking across it, one leg on the other side of the top side, one leg in, and it sprung up and it caught his leg in between the gate. And that's how his injury occurred. So I just want to let you know that that's what happened. Now, I don't know if that changes any of your opinions or not, or supports
first
any of
of
your
all, wait.
opinions or not, but the doctor asked me to explain what happened, and I just did. So,
Well, that's your version of what happened, so I'm just going to object to the foundation of whatever question's going to follow that explanation.
I join.
Yeah, there's a
I guess
dispute on
the
how it's
the reason I ask is because I couldn't see a description anywhere close to that in any of the records that were available to the providers at that time.
Right.
did the defense attorney show you the gate animation?
They did.
The one prepared by you?
Right, with what is Mr. Tolson's body stuck in the gate?
Well, they provided me the DVD, and I believe there were two DVDs. There was one that was sort of an anatomical rendering
Right.
of the knee, and
Yes,
the
sir.
other was an animation of the gate, and I did see both of those, yeah.
Okay. All right. So you have some idea from the gait animation of how Mr. Tolson's injury occurred?
No,
I
that's...
don't know, all I know is what the
Just
animation
for
showed.
the
Okay.
record, it was an animation prepared by plaintiff's counsel, okay? And we dispute that's how the injury occurred.
Did the defense attorneys also give you Mr. Tolson's affidavit, where he swore under oath that the manner in which the gate came up and trapped him, as reflected in the gait animation, was accurate as to how he was injured?
Do you mean the affidavit that contradicts his deposition testimony? That one?
Doctor, did they show you Mr. Tolson's affidavit?
I don't recall that.
No.
Okay, all right. Now, getting back to your, strike that. Does the severity of the ligamentous injury in a patient's body increase the suspicion of a dislocation to the knee?
It could, yes.
Is a doctor or physician assistant who may be suspecting that the patient has a dislocated knee, would if there was a range of motion testing and ligamentous injury testing, and the knee was significantly unstable, do you believe that should be taken into consideration by the doctor and/or physician assistant when determining whether or not a dislocation has occurred?
Check the form and foundation.
I'm sorry, your question began when you said the patient has a dislocation. That's different than had a dislocation. So which do you mean? Because it means different to me.
Okay. Well, what does has a dislocation mean to you?
It means that it's dislocated now.
Okay.
Had means that it was and now it's not.
Right. Had then.
Okay, thank you. The answer to your question is no. Even under a circumstance where I knew as a treating physician, and I'll put it in the orthopedic context, which is my expertise, that patient had sustained a dislocation of their knee, and their knee was now reduced, and their x-ray was now normal, and their vascular status was now normal, exactly what was done for Mr. Tolson is the appropriate treatment and the standard of care.
Okay. If the vascular assessment was abnormal in Mr. Tolson's case,
As defined by what?
how do you define abnormal? How do you find
I
an
could
abnormal
define it.
vascular assessment?
Well, again, an abnormal vascular assessment that would require further evaluation would be absence of pulse, cold foot, perhaps paresthesias or neurological deficit, appropriate mechanism, a combination of factors, not just one. So if there were all of those factors that suggested vascular compromise at the time of the evaluation, that is in a situation that mandates, by the standard of care, immediate evaluation, vascular consultation, and treatment.
Do you plan on giving any opinions in this case when Mr. Tolson sustained intimal tear to his popliteal artery?
Possibly.
Okay, good. I need to know one way or the other whether you intend to give an opinion. And it's either yes or no. I need to know.
Well, again, I don't know. It would depend on what the question was.
Let me ask you a question. Do you intend to give an opinion in this case?
Sure.
As to
if
when,
asked.
as to when Mr. Tolson sustained a tear to the popliteal artery in his left leg?
Objection to the phrase tear, but you can
I'm
answer.
sorry. I don't know what tear means either. You
Yeah.
have to define that for me.
Do you know what the term intimal tear with respect to arterial injuries mean?
Sure.
Okay, that's what I'm talking about.
Well,
Intimal tear.
see, tear to me could mean the artery is torn in half.
Fair
It could
enough,
mean
Doctor.
intimal tear.
Fair
So, I
enough.
mean, that doesn't help me when
Fair
you just say
enough.
tear.
I understand. Let me ask the question again. Do you have an opinion in this case, one way or the other, whether Mr. Tolson sustained an intimal tear to his popliteal artery on December 3rd, 2009?
What I believe I can say is that Mr. Tolson sustained an injury to his popliteal artery in some form at the time of this injury on 12/3. I don't know if it was an intimal tear, I don't know if it was a contusion, I don't know if it was a partial laceration. I have no way of knowing it, but I think his popliteal artery was traumatized at that time, yes.
Okay. And do you have an opinion whether or not the injury progressed to any degree
Sure.
at the time he was in the emergency room?
You mean while he was in the emergency room?
Right, while he was in the emergency room.
No evidence of that in the record at all.
Do you have any opinion whether it did or did not?
Based on the record, it did not.
If at the time he was in the emergency room, he had a cold foot, his foot was numb, he had some paresthesias, and he had an absence of pulse, would your opinion change?
Objection to the hypothetical.
Is that a
would it-
hypothetical? Because that's certainly not what the record indicates, but
Right.
if that's a hypothetical, I'm happy to answer that.
It's a hypothetical based upon a testimony of Mr. Tolston and opinions of other doctors in the case.
That he had no pulses?
Absence of pulse, cold foot, paresthesia, and unable to move the feet. Based upon that hypothetical,
Okay.
can you tell me whether or not you believe the injury to his popliteal artery worsened while he was in the emergency room?
Objection
Objection.
to lack of foundation in the incomplete
Well,
hypothetical.
Worsens, to me, implies that it was, at one point, it was different and more severe than at another point, correct?
Sure.
And I don't see any evidence in the record that that occurred during this emergency room stay.
But I want you to assume from my hypothetical that there was an absence of pulse in his foot. He had a cold foot. His foot was numb. He was experiencing paresthesia in the left leg while he was in the emergency room. Based upon that hypothetical, do you believe the injury to his popliteal artery worsened during the time he was in the emergency room?
Not to nitpick,
so-
but do you mean those symptoms developed over the time he was in the emergency department? Is that your hypothetical?
Doctor,
Or he
do
presented with those?
Doctor, do you understand my question?
I don't, I'm
first?
sorry, but again, to come back to my original premise, for something to worsen, it would have to imply that it was one way at
Right.
one point and different, and in fact, worse at another point.
Okay.
If you're saying that that's the way it was from the minute he arrived, then there's no evidence that it worsened in your hypothetical. If you're saying to me that his foot was warm and he had a pulse and he could move it when he arrived, and then the hypothetical took place some point later, then yes, it worsened, and yes, that would raise suspicion and concern.
Okay,
So I hope
thank
that
you.
answers your question.
You did answer my question. I appreciate that. Do you have an opinion of one way or the other when Mr. Tolston developed a pseudoaneurysm in his popliteal artery?
No.
Do you have an opinion one way or the other whether Mr. Tolston was negligent and whether any negligence on his part caused or contributed to his injuries?
I don't know. I don't know. There is some evidence in some of the records and deposition testimony that I reviewed that suggested he may have removed his brace, he may have been walking on the leg, he may have been moving the knee, and I don't know if that's true or not. If in fact any or all of that is true, then yes, that could have been contributory negligence to the problem.
Okay. Now, to what degree?
I don't understand the question, I'm sorry.
What is
Okay,
your
right.
question?
You're saying that if any of these were true, he removed the brace, he walked on the knee, it could have contributed to or worsened his injury. I need to know the basis of your opinion and what worsening, if any, you believe occurred in Mr. Tolston's leg, if any of those things happened.
Well, the first part is that the knee is immobilized for support, and the support is provided to protect the knee and surrounding structures from further injury. So if a patient removes that support, then they're at greater risk to have further injury to either the knee or the surrounding structures. Included in that is the possibility to further traumatize, injure, or contribute to vascular compromise.
Right, but I want to know, do you have an opinion whether or not there was a worsening of his injury because a removal of the splint occurred after he left the hospital?
Again, I don't know if the splint was removed. I don't know if he did walk on the leg. All I know is that there's evidence in the records that he may have. If he did, then I think it is more likely than not that that contributed to the ultimate problems that he had.
I need to know how that contributed to the ultimate problems. Why do you believe
Because, as I
that?
mentioned earlier, the splint is applied for a reason, and the reason is to support the injured knee to protect the structures of the knee and the surrounding structures. If you remove that splint, those structures, including the artery, are at greater risk of further trauma, and that's how it would occur.
Well, what specific injury are you talking about? I need to know what injury. Was it an injury to a ligament? Was it an injury to the artery? What type of an injury to the artery occurred, and how did that worsen his condition?
Objection?
Well, the ligament injury that was present would result in instability of the knee. The instability of the knee could lead to displacement of the bone structure, which could cause impairment to the artery, which in turn could contribute to vascular compromise.
But I want to know how. I want to know.
I tried to explain, I'll try
Yeah.
one more time.
Yeah.
Again, the knee is inherently unstable by virtue of the ligament injury that occurred. So one bone can shift and move abnormally relative to the other, hence the definition of ligamentous instability of the knee. The external support is applied to prevent that, to minimize the risk of that. If one removes that external support, the risk of that abnormal displacement of one bone on the other, i.e. ligamentous instability, is greatly increased. If you combine removing the brace with putting weight on it, with bending it, with walking on it, all of those things together can raise the risk even higher of a bone in the knee moving, compressing, damaging, injuring the artery. Now, what the extent of that would be, I would only be speculating, and I'm not a vascular specialist, but it could happen.
Okay.
If the brace wasn't important, you wouldn't put it on him,
Right.
is my point.
And if Mr. Tolson had tried to walk on his left leg without his brace, based upon the ligamentous injuries we know he suffered, would he experience significant pain?
I would expect so, yes.
And would his knee more likely than not buckle under his own weight if he tried to put weight on that left leg in light of his ligamentous injuries?
Certainly possible.
Now, Doctor, you testified that the defense attorney sent you a DVD that had a three-dimensional spinning knee.
Yes.
Do you remember that? And do you remember? And I have it here in case you need to look at it to refresh your recollection. But do you believe that based upon your reading of the MRI report and your knowledge of the structures of the knee, that 3D animation first correctly identifies the ligamentous structures, muscles, and tendons that surround the knee joint?
Yes, I think it's an accurate anatomical description of normal anatomy, yes.
Thank you. And the second part of the rotational three-dimensional injury of the knee depicted injuries to the structures within inside the knee, correct?
Yes.
And do you believe that based upon the MRI report, that three-dimensional animation fairly and accurately depicted the injuries to the structures of Mr. Tolson's knee that were identified on the December 9th, 2000?
Look at that report again. just
Yeah,
to
sure.
refresh
I
my
will
memory.
definitely give it to you, Doctor.
Thank you.
It's exhibit number 3, and if you need to take a look at the animation, I could show you that as well.
Just object to form and foundation.
Same for me.
I think in fairness, you should show it to him.
Do you need to see it? I'd be glad to show
To
it
be
to
honest
you.
with you, I've reviewed it earlier today,
Oh, okay.
so it's fairly fresh in my mind.
Okay.
Oh, it is? Go ahead, Doc.
And to answer your question, I think that there are some aspects of the animation that inaccurately depict the severity of the injuries that occurred based on the MRI. Specifically, the animation shows complete disruption, I believe, of the posterior oblique ligament. This says a moderate sprain. It shows a near complete disruption of the medial collateral ligament, and this shows a partially disrupted posterior portion, and the animation shows it to be anterior. The animation shows a, if I'm not mistaken, complete tear of the posterior cruciate ligament, and the MRI describes a near complete tear of the posterior cruciate ligament. So I think there are some aspects of the animation that are somewhat overstated relative to the facts in the MRI.
Okay. Now, have you looked at the actual MRI films?
Again, I don't recall, but I may not have.
Okay. Would it be helpful, I have the films with me here today, would it be helpful for you to take a look at the films, to compare the injuries to the ligaments on the films, and then to compare the animation to see if they match up?
Helpful. Do you want him to do that?
Yeah, would you, I would like for you to do that, Doc.
I'm
We
happy
could
to
take
do
a
that.
break?
I'm happy
Okay,
to do that.
sure.
I don't know that I'll say something different than the radiologist said, but I'm happy to do it.
Thank you. Let's take a break off the record.
We should off the record at 2:24 p.m. Back on the record, the time is now 2:41 p.m.
Okay.
Now, what do you want him to do with these films?
Hang on a second.
Okay.
Doctor, during the break, did you have the opportunity to look at Mr. Tolson's MRI films from the December 9th, 2009 MRI?
I did.
Okay. And Doctor, have you placed some white exhibit stickers on some of those films?
I have.
What I'd like for you to do now, if you could with your pen, if you could write on those white exhibit stickers what structure, ligamentous structure, is depicted in the little square film that you placed a sticker on.
So let me try to begin by clarifying. Before we went on break, I mentioned some of the factors that I thought were incorrect in the animation.
Yes, you did.
One of those that I mentioned was the depiction of the posterior cruciate ligament. In fact, I had the opportunity to re-review the animation here just a minute ago, and in fact, I'm going to retract that, and the posterior cruciate ligament does seem to be fairly represented in the animation. So, so where we have disagreement or discrepancy exclusively pertains to the medial aspect of the knee. No disagreement now with the posterior cruciate ligament depiction, no disagreement with the depiction of the injuries on the lateral side of the knee. Okay? Now, that said, the animation, and again I'm referring to 1 minute and 30 seconds into it so everyone knows we're on the same page, shows injury to what appears to me to be medial patellofemoral ligament and medial capsule. On this image here, and I think on others, the medial patellofemoral ligament and medial capsule are intact. There is no reference in the radiologist's report to injury to those structures either. So in that sense, I think the animation and depiction is inaccurate. There is also evidence in the animation to an injury to the anterior portion of the medial collateral ligament, when in fact I believe the anterior portion of the medial collateral ligament is intact, and it is more the posterior portion of the medial collateral ligament that is injured, and that's also depicted in this MRI that I've marked MCL. The third thing is that there is evidence, and it's in the report, and I believe also evident more in this image that I've marked MCL, of an injury to the posterior oblique ligament, and that's not even shown on the animation at all. It's not represented anatomically at all. So there's an element of the injury that's incorrect on the animation, and there's an element that's not included in the animation, if that makes sense.
Okay.
Rodney, I'm sorry, just, I don't mean to interrupt, but I didn't get to object before you weighed in on your comments on the animation, but I just have an objection to having you ask Dr. Matthews to comment on the accuracy or inaccuracies of your computer-generated animation. Sorry, go ahead.
I join in that objection.
Okay. So, have you made other notations on those little stickers?
These were relative to the posterior cruciate ligament, and once I look at the animation, they're fine.
Okay,
So
so
just these two?
just these two that you just handed
And I
to me?
mark one is MCL and the other is MPFL, which is medial patellofemoral ligament.
Okay. So the last one that you testified to was an injury that's on the MRI, but is missing from the animation.
That is correct.
Is that the medial collateral ligament
No,
posterior
it's-
oblique? I'm
It's a
sorry.
posterior oblique.
Posterior oblique ligament.
Is absent from the animation and shows some element of what I would consider mild trauma or injury on the MRI. And the medial collateral ligament was described as showing a partial tear posteriorly, and it's anteriorly on the animation.
And I'm sorry, again, just so I'm clear, what did we mark on the films? Did you,
We marked the area demonstrating the integrity of the medial patellofemoral ligament, which is in fact on the animation shown to be torn and therefore inaccurate.
okay,
And I marked the integrity, the MRI that shows the integrity of the anterior portion of the medial collateral ligament, which is shown on the animation to be injured.
okay, thank you.
Are those all of the criticisms that you have with respect to the three-dimensional animation?
Just note my continuing objection to this.
Yes, in terms of demonstrating what I interpret to be the ligamentous injuries, I think it's otherwise okay.
Okay. So if I ask my illustrator to go back to the drawing board and make the corrections as you've testified, would you believe then that that three-dimensional animation would fairly and accurately depict the injuries that Mr. Tolson sustained to the structures within his knee on December 3rd, 2009?
Okay, now this has gone far afield from what's permissible, and I'm not going to have Dr. Matthews testify on an animation that doesn't exist yet and he hasn't seen. And I don't think it's fair of you to ask him that question, so I'm not going to let him answer.
Doctor, have you worked with medical illustrators before?
Yes,
And you're familiar with the use of illustrations at trial?
sure.
And you've used illustrations at trial in order to explain to the members of the jury injuries that, in fact, your patients have sustained, correct?
I've been involved in cases where still images have been used. I don't know if I've been involved in an animation like this before, quite honestly.
Okay. If we make the corrections that you said need to be made to the animation, would you believe then that the animation would fairly and accurately depict the injuries that were demonstrated on the MRI films?
I'm not going to allow Dr. Matthews to testify about an animation that hasn't even been made yet and that he hasn't been shown and it had the ability to look at. And also, I don't think that your question is reasonably calculated to lead to admissible evidence in this case and beyond the scope of permissible discovery for this witness. So
I join.
I'm not going to let him answer that question, Rodney.
Doctor,
It's your animation,
It-
your duty to make it right, not ours.
if you come to court and testify in this case, would you believe it would be helpful to use a three-dimensional animation such as the one that you've seen here today in order to explain the injuries to the ligamentous structures inside of Mr. Tolson's knee?
Objection.
Objection.
I don't know. Could be. Yeah, and I guess it's who's your audience. I don't know. If it's the jury, I just don't know.
And if we're going to use an animation, we'll make one and provide it for you.
Yeah. Doctor, do you disagree? Have you read Dr. Malik's deposition testimony?
I have.
Do you disagree with any of his testimony?
Probably.
Can you tell me what portions that you disagree with?
Objection.
Objection.
What you have to understand, Mr. Gaston, is I've read, all of these depositions, and I can't recall every specific thing that every one of your experts or another expert might have said that I might disagree with. But I will globally say that anything that is contained in those depositions, including Dr. Malik's, that suggest or infer that there was a breach of the standard of care as it pertained to Mr. Tolson's management in the emergency room on the initial presentation to St. Agnes, I disagree with.
Okay.
It's the best I can answer.
What about the description by Dr. Malik of the vascular injury that Mr. Tolson sustained, do you plan on addressing that opinion in any way, shape, or form?
What opinion is that,
I don't know
Tony?
what opinion specifically you're talking about. I know Dr. Malik well. He's not a vascular specialist any more than I am, so I wouldn't rely on his testimony relative to the vascular status at all.
What about his explanation of the orthopedic injuries Mr. Tolson sustained in this case? Do you have any criticism of those opinions?
I'd have to look specifically at what you're referring to. I'm
Okay,
sorry, I just don't recall.
All right, and here's why we have a problem. Because what I don't want to have happen is we show up in court and my expert testifies in accordance with his deposition testimony as to the opinions he has on the orthopedic injuries. And then you take the stand and the lawyer says, tell me what opinions you disagree with. And then I haven't heard them now. So, and I'm entitled to know all of your opinions now instead of waiting to trial to get this. And I know this may be a tedious process, but this is my only opportunity to ask you what opinions you disagree with respect to Dr. Malik's. So that's, and if we have to take a break,
Why don't you
and
ask
let
him
you-
what the opinion is? If you
and
tell him
if we
what
have
the
to take,
opinion is.
just a minute, if we have to take a break for you to read Dr. Malik's deposition again and to pick out points we specifically disagree with his opinions, we can do that. But otherwise, I don't have another opportunity to ask you those questions.
Well, that's why you should come prepared with questions, specific questions. Tell the doctor what opinion Dr. Malik has said, and ask him if he agrees or disagrees with it.
See, but ma'am, you don't get to tell me how to conduct a deposition. See, that's
Well,
the
I
problem.
sorta do,
So,
since it's
you
my
don't.
witness.
Doctor, my question is, and I need to know if today you intend to come to court and disagree with any of the opinions that Dr. Malik has to say other than standard of care.
That's the answer. Objection. Go ahead.
The only way, I mean, it would help me more if you said to me, I plan on using these opinions that Dr. Malik renders as part of my case. Can you tell me if you agree or disagree? And I can give you that answer in 2 seconds.
Exactly.
But if you can't tell me specifically what you're referring to, I don't know how to answer your question.
Well, then we can go through Dr. Malik's deposition page by page, and when we reach one of his opinions, I can ask you to address it, or we can take a 10-minute break. You can read his deposition and make a note yourself, whatever you'd like to do.
It's not going to happen.
I'm not going to be able to read his
Objection.
deposition in 10 minutes.
Exactly. He's just told you how he needs to respond to how you need to rephrase your question so that he can reasonably respond. If you refuse to do that, that's up to you. But
As we sit here today, Doctor, do you have an independent recollection of the opinions that Dr. Malik gave, setting aside the standard of care opinions, that you disagree with? As you sit here today, do you have that recollection?
Not as a specific point by point, no.
Okay. Do you have a recollection today with respect to opinions given by Dr. Larson, excluding standard of care, that you disagree with?
Again, I can't recall specifically.
And how about Dr. Collier, vascular
Same
expert?
answer.
Okay. Or any other expert that may have testified?
Again, same answer.
Okay. All right. Yeah. Do you agree that the injuries that are depicted in the MRI films that were taken of Mr. Tolson's left knee on December 9th, 2009, occurred on December 3rd, 2009?
I have no reason to believe otherwise.
Okay. And there's no reason to believe that Mr. Tolson sustained an additional injury to his knee from the time he left St. Agnes Hospital to the time he arrived at Concentra on December the 5th. Would
Objection.
that be a fair statement?
referring to the ligaments on the MRI,
Any injuries?
any injuries.
Yeah.
Well, as we said
Objection.
earlier, if, and again, I don't know that this is the case, so I don't want to imply something that's not fact, but if indeed he removed the brace, bent his knee, walked on his knee, and some things that were suggested, it's possible that he could have, as I mentioned, contributed to the injury to his artery. It's possible he could have caused more swelling and pain and edema in his knee. I don't think that would cause the actual ligamentous injury that is depicted in this MRI, no.
Okay. All right. Doctor, what is the relevance of a fusion that was shown on the plain film X-ray that was taken on December the 3rd at St. Agnes Hospital?
If effusion is a general term that is used to describe fluid in the joint.
Okay. Do you have an opinion one way or the other whether there is effusion, whether effusion results from every dislocation?
Well, every dislocation will result in swelling, will result in bleeding, and that can lead to effusion. It doesn't always, because effusion is best seen on an X-ray when the knee is a contained environment. When you have ligamentous disruption, the environment is disrupted. So it's like leaving the door open in the room or the floodgate open, and the fluid can leak out of the joint, and sometimes therefore is less apparent on an X-ray than it would be if it was a less severe injury, if that makes sense.
Do you know whether in this case you had the dam breaking and the fluid leaking
Sure
out?
Sure there was. But I
Okay.
have looked at the X-ray, and I do think there was evidence of swelling and effusion in the joint. And in this setting, with the relative close proximity between the time of the injury and the time of the X-ray, it almost certainly equilibrated with blood or indicated bleeding in the joint.
Okay. And do you believe the swelling, the blood, and the effusion was as a result of the injury Mr. Tolson sustained shortly before he arrived at the emergency room?
Yes.
Okay. Have you ever treated a dislocated knee in an emergency room?
Sure. Yes.
Can you tell us how many times?
I've treated a dislocated knee many more times than I've treated a dislocated knee in the emergency room, because oftentimes they're referred to me after the emergency room. 2 days, 3 days, 5 days later. That's a much more common scenario. And I don't take emergency room call, and I'm not often called down there to do that at this stage, but I frequently see dislocated knees after the fact. And that's in the course of my career, probably 100 or more. But how many I actually saw in the emergency room at the time, a much smaller number, because that's not where I do my practice.
Are you planning to give any opinion one way or the other with respect to ischemia developing or worsening in Mr. Tolson's left foot and left leg?
Objection.
Sure might.
Well, if you might, I need to know what opinions you have with respect to the issue of ischemia in Mr. Tolson's left foot and left leg.
Objection to the form. It's not really a question, but go ahead.
Same objections.
I'll try to answer this as best I can, and I don't know this would be all inclusive of what I might render an opinion on, depending on what I was asked. But I'm of the opinion, the very strong opinion, that Mr. Tolson's leg, foot, lower extremity was not ischemic when he was evaluated in the emergency room, nor when he was discharged from the emergency room on December the 3rd.
And what is the basis for that opinion?
That he had 3 separate people examine his knee and document presence of pedal pulses. There is no evidence, despite the hypothetical earlier, that his foot was cold. There is no evidence of any other signs of ischemia that are documented in the record. And again, that's by 3 separate providers. Moreover, in my experience, and I believe even included in the testimony of many of your own experts, an ischemic limb rapidly deteriorates over a period of 6-8 hours, and that number is consistent in all the discovery that has been going on with this case. Mr. Tolson went home and went to bed. He slept all night. He got up the next morning. He didn't go see a doctor till 2 days later. That's not the progression of an acutely ischemic limb. It just isn't. It isn't the way it works. So I don't think there's any evidence in this record at all that his leg was compromised or ischemic when he arrived or left the emergency room, and not until sometime on that day of the 5th when he presented was ischemia more apparent. So my opinion is that at some point after he was seen in the emergency room and before he was seen on the 5th, the ischemia developed. When exactly that was, I don't know.
Do you have any idea when?
Well,
that
again,
developed?
if you believe your own experts who say that it's 6 or 8 hours, then it was probably 6 or 8 hours before he went to that facility on the 5th and was sent back to St. Agnes.
But-
I'm not a vascular expert, and I wouldn't claim myself to be able to state that with absolute certainty. But I can state with absolute certainty that that leg was not ischemic when he left the emergency room.
Okay. How come you're not able to say with reasonable certainty when it started, but you can't say it didn't occur at the time he was in the emergency room?
Objection to form.
Don't understand that question, I'm sorry.
Okay. Your opinion is his leg wasn't ischemic in the emergency room, but it started sometime thereafter he left St. Agnes, but you don't know the time that it began, correct?
Correct.
Okay, now, how come, and is your opinion that his leg wasn't ischemic because of the evaluations conducted by the medical providers in the emergency room?
Well, as I say, that's part of it, it's not the only part.
Okay.
Because of everything he said.
Hang on a second. And are you assuming that the medical providers conducted an accurate examination and evaluation of Mr. Tolson's left leg and foot in order for you to reach the opinion that his left leg and foot was not ischemic when he was in the emergency room?
Objection to form and foundation.
All I can state is that there are clearly documented records entered by 3 separate providers that indicate he had palpable pedal pulses, that he was vascularly intact in the emergency room. That's what's there, and that's fact, and that's all I can base my opinion on.
And are you assuming that those notations in the emergency room record are true and accurate?
Sure, why would I not?
Okay. And that's also based upon the assumption that the providers who performed the evaluations did them accurately and recorded their findings accurately, correct?
Objection to form.
Yes.
Okay. Now, in order for you to render an opinion that Mr. Tolson's leg began to show signs of ischemia while he was in the emergency room, what would you need to see in the medical chart?
Objection to the form and foundation.
Same objections.
Clear-cut indications of ischemia which are not present in the record.
Which are what? Define that for me, doctor.
We've talked about it already.
Yeah.
Absence of pulses, cold foot, paresthesias, locks of motion, pallor in the lower extremity, an injury that would be compatible with that diagnosis, all those things of which most are not present, based on the record.
Do you have an opinion as to what % of knee dislocations reduce before the patient arrives in the emergency room?
Not with absolute certainty. It's the minority. The majority do not. The majority stay dislocated unless there's been some manipulation performed in the field by a third party.
And do you have an opinion as to what % of knee dislocations result in injury to the popliteal artery?
Again, it depends, and not all knee dislocations are the same. Knees can dislocate anteriorly, posteriorly, medially, or laterally. Posterior dislocations have the highest incidence of associated popliteal artery injury. And then from there, the question gets tricky because it depends on how you define injury and what needs to be done about it. A larger percentage of those, perhaps greater than 50%, will cause some element of injury to the artery. A significant percentage of those require no treatment. The artery is not severely injured, heals, gets better, no vascular compromise, no ischemia, no catastrophic result. A smaller percentage, a more significant vascular event occurs that requires intervention, and if intervention isn't successful, can result in loss of limb.
Do you have an opinion one way or the other? Whether if Mr. Tolson had a vascular intervention while he was in St. Agnes Hospital on December 3rd, 2009, his leg could have been saved?
Objection to the
Objection.
term vascular intervention.
Objection to form.
I don't have an opinion.
Okay. Doctor, is a dislocated knee a limb-threatening injury?
Not usually.
can it be a limb-threatening injury because of the possibility of the injury to the popliteal artery?
Can it be? Yes.
Do you believe in this case that Mr. Tolson sustained a posterior dislocation of his knee, which resulted in an injury to the popliteal artery?
Yeah, please.
Okay, well, we can wait a minute. I'll re-ask the question. Is it your opinion, within a reasonable degree of medical probability within the field of orthopedic medicine, that Mr. Tolson sustained a posterior dislocation of his knee that resulted in an injury to his popliteal artery on December 3rd, 2009?
Objection.
Yes.
Yes, you have an opinion, or yes, that is what you believe happened?
Both.
Okay. All right. I don't know that we talked about Dr. Jackson yet. What's your understanding of the care that Dr. Jackson provided to Mr. Tolson while he was in the emergency room on December 3rd, 2009?
Objection.
Again, it was my understanding that she was the emergency room attending who became involved in Mr. Tolson's evaluation and management, that she was supervising the physician's assistant, and that she participated in the decision-making that went into his treatment and ultimate discharge plan.
Did you reach that opinion from looking at the medical record alone?
I don't recall.
Do you know from the medical record alone what, if anything, Dr. Jackson wrote there in the record that she did for Mr. Tolson?
I'd have to look again to refresh my memory, if that's okay.
Sure.
There are several pages of records from the St. Agnes emergency room that describe the situation with the patient's injury, that he was injured at work, that it was caught up in a barrier. So there's a history here. There's a review of systems. There's a physical examination, including documentation of palpable pulses and so on, that is signed by both the physician's assistant and Dr. Jackson. So I assume from the medical records that Dr. Jackson participated in this evaluation, reviewed the record as it was generated, agreed with it, therefore signed it. And so that's the extent of my understanding of her involvement.
And when you mean participated in the evaluation, did you mean that she was side by side with physician assistant Shaw while physician assistant Shaw was conducting her evaluation of Mr.
I have no way of
Tolson?
knowing that.
Okay, that's what I'm trying to figure from the record.
I have no way of knowing that from the record. But what I can say is that Dr. Jackson, for whatever reason, because she was side by side, she had a respect and relationship for P.A. Shaw's abilities, some combination of both, felt comfortable documenting and signing the record as it was produced.
And what she signed, there's one page that contains her notes. If you could go to that.
Her notes.
Page number?
I think we got, it's your page 16, but I'm not sure what page the doctor has. But it's this box here. I think you had it just a minute ago.
Yeah, okay, it's page 13.
Yes, we're on the same page.
I got you.
Right.
Okay.
And it looks like from Dr. Jackson's testimony, she wrote on here, patient seen with PA agree with care. Is that the box that you're referring to that you're relying upon when you say that you believe Dr. Jackson complied with the standard of care by indicating in the record that the patient was seen with the physician's assistant and that she agreed with the care?
That is correct.
Okay. Did the standard of care require Dr. Jackson to do her own independent examination of Mr. Tolson after physician's assistant Shaw examined him?
No.
Did the standard of care require Dr. Jackson to suspect that Mr. Tolson had a dislocated knee?
Objection to form.
Did the standard of care require Dr. Jackson to order any other radiology studies other than one was ordered in this case?
No.
Is there you mentioned there were various ways to measure the flow of blood into a patient's leg. Is a handheld Doppler an additional method
It is.
that can be used to measure a flow of blood in a patient's leg?
It is.
And I know you're not an expert in vascular surgery, but do you have you looked at ankle-brachial indexes with respect to the values that appear after the test is done?
I'm familiar with them, yes.
Okay. And can you tell me, of the values, which would indicate an abnormal or a decrease of flow in blood? If we start with 1.0
As normal.
As normal, yes, doctor.
Again, it's like many other tests. You can't, in my experience, rely on it as a solo evaluation. So the smaller the number, the greater the concern about vascular impairment. So 0.1 would be worse than 0.9. But you also have to use that information in a larger, broader clinical context based on the examination of the leg, presence of pulses, whether it's cold, whether it's pale, whether there's pain, whether there's movement. So it's something that can be useful. It's not exclusively or in a vacuum solely reliable. And the problems come if you get a 0.8 or a 0.9 or a 0.7. And is that because the patient has an injury? Is it because they have chronic arterial disease? Again, there's no way to know that as an isolated test at one point in time, so you have to use it in context.
Would an ankle-brachial index of 0.8, in a patient who sustained a traumatic injury to his leg, such as Mr. Colson, give the physician's assistant or doctor who had looked at that reason for further assessment of the foot?
Objection to foundation and form.
Same objections.
Well, I don't think you would do an ankle-brachial index unless you'd already assessed the foot. So the sequencing there doesn't make sense to me in your question. The other is that you would also compare it to the opposite leg, for example, and you would do other things to try to understand the validity of that number.
Right. What I'm trying to understand is if the one leg is 1.0, which would be normal, and the injured leg is 0.8.
Don't know. Again, like I said, it doesn't necessarily mean vascular injury. It could mean chronic vascular insufficiency from atherosclerosis. It could mean other things, vascular spasm. So you have to look at that number in the context of the overall patient's presentation. Now, if it was 0.2, you got a much bigger concern than if it's 0.8.
Is there a continuum between 0.1 and 0.8 where a doctor...
1.0 and 0.0, sorry.
0.1
0.1,
and 0.8.
Okay.
Is there a continuum where the suspicion is so significant that a vascular consultation is warranted?
Same answer. An ankle-brachial index is a guide. It's not an absolute test. If 4 people do it, you may get 4 different results. So it has to be used in a broader context, not exclusively on its own, in my opinion.
Palpating for pulses, is that test somewhat subjective based upon the person who's performing the examination?
Well, I think it can be, and I know that I've read depositions from some of your experts who talk about people being able to feel pulses on walls and things like that. What's most important to me in this record is that this was 3 separate people at different points in time palpating pulses and documenting their presence. That, to me, is not something that's going to be likely to be the same mistake made by 3 people.
If Now, you did read Mr. Tolson's testimony and the testimony of his sister where at one point, at least at one point while he was in the examining room, he had complained to a nurse that his foot was cold to the touch and he had no feeling in his foot. Did you read that?
Objection?
Objection.
I believe so, yes.
Okay. If that actually happened in this case, would the standard of care of the nurse who was informed of this complaint, would it require her to bring that complaint to the attention of either the physician's assistant or the emergency room physician?
Objection?
Object to the hypothetical, the incomplete nature of the hypothetical.
I would say more likely what would happen would be the nurse would evaluate that complaint and see if the foot was indeed cold, see if there was indeed motion or lack thereof, and if there was corroboration between the nursing assessment and the patient's complaints, that yes, it would be incumbent upon that nurse to bring in other more skilled observers and evaluation.
So the standard of care upon a nurse receiving that complaint from Mr. Tolson would be to do an assessment of his foot at that time. Is that a fair statement?
Objection to
Yes.
the form and incomplete nature of the hypothetical.
And if the nurse failed to reassess his foot after receiving those complaints, would that be a breach of the standard of care?
Again, objection to the incomplete nature of your
It might be,
hypothetical.
it might not be. I'm sorry, you keep doing that, I apologize.
If the standard of care requires a nurse to do a reassessment, if she didn't do the reassessment, how come that wouldn't be a breach of the standard
Well,
of care?
maybe she did it just 5 minutes ago. Maybe the patient's been complaining about that for 2 hours and you've reassessed him 5 times and it's always been the same, and they don't correlate. So it just depends on the situation. But if it was the very first time and it represented a change and she evaluated the patient, found a change that was significant and demonstrable, she should get other evaluation. If she didn't do that in the face of changing complaints and changing findings, then I would say, yes, that would be a breach.
So, does it matter how soon the last complaint of coldness and numbness to the foot was made to the nurse?
It could.
That depends upon whether or not the standard of care required a reassessment?
Objection to the hypothetical, no foundation whatsoever, and the incomplete nature of the questions posed to the witness.
Disagree
Same
completely.
objection.
Doctor, go ahead and answer.
Well, the answer
I think
is
it calls for
it could.
speculation.
And again, if I have a patient that says to me, Doc, my foot's cold, and I examine their foot's not cold, and 2 minutes later says my foot's cold, and I examine his foot's not cold, and we go through that for 7 times or 10 times, at some point I'm going to say, you know what, your foot's not cold. And I'm not going to examine you for the 13th time and the 14th time. And the same with motion. If a patient says, I can't move my foot, and yet I examine them and they can move their foot, and again, and we go through it, at some point it becomes a little less relevant than if it was a one-off, one-time significant change. So that's the point I'm trying to make. It depends on the situation.
What I'm trying to figure out in this case.
Well, in this case, there's no evidence that that happened.
God, let me ask
sorry.
the question. It's
On
okay.
the-
I know. In this case, how many times, in your opinion, would a nurse have to assess Mr. Tolson's foot, find that it wasn't cold, in order to then say, on the last time before he left the hospital, if he complained of a cold foot and his foot was numb, they wouldn't have to do a reassessment?
Wow. Object to the form and foundation.
Go ahead.
I object as well. There's absolutely no foundation for that, and I don't think it's an appropriate question to answer. I
Go
don't.
ahead.
Well, what I can say from the record is that when he got there, some point during his stay, and when he was sent home, he had 3 different people document that his pulses were present. That is, in my opinion, an adequate evaluation, regardless of anything else in your hypothetical.
Okay, so any complaints that happened after those 3 persons assessed his pulses and according to the chart found that they were normal and found that his foot cold, there was no requirement for a reassessment at the time he was discharged.
Objection.
Would that be fair?
Objection to the hypothetical form and foundation.
I'm still not following your question. I'm sorry. As I read this record, he was put in a knee immobilizer after his neurovascular status was his vascular status was documented to be normal, and he was discharged. So that seems to me to be as close to an evaluation before he left as could possibly have occurred.
Right. So then if he had a subsequent complaint of cold foot, made it to the nurse after the immobilizer was placed on, after the neurovascular test was done, then the nurse did not have a duty to reassess his foot at that time. Would that be a fair statement of what your opinion is?
Objection asked and answered.
Form and foundation and hypothetical.
Those as well.
So you're saying now in a hypothetical
Right.
that he's put in a splint, His vascular status is documented to be normal, and at some point after that, he complains his foot's cold.
Yes, doctor.
And he's never complained about that before.
No, doctor.
Then I would say, yes, that would require reevaluation,
That would require reevaluation.
if that,
Okay.
if that hypothetical had occurred.
All right.
Again, no record of that, but
All right, thank you. Have we explored all of your opinions, that you have a recollection of
I'm a
what this
pretty
does?
opinionated guy, no, I don't know.
You can object to the form and foundation.
Again, I think we've covered everything that I anticipate testifying on. I don't know, I can't tell you that there wouldn't be others if specific questions arose that we haven't covered today. But I honestly don't think there's anything that's going to surprise you.
Okay, and have we covered all the factual basis for the opinions that you intend
think
to
so.
give in this case?
Same objection.
Okay. Is there any documents that we haven't talked about that you have relied upon for the opinions that you're going to give?
Objection.
No, I mean, we've got everything I've seen right here.
Right. For example, what I'm worried about is that when we come to court, oh, there's this one page of a lab value here that further supports the opinions that I have, and it's buried somewhere in the record that we haven't talked about.
If it is, I haven't seen it.
Okay, all right. All right.
Counsel, I'm going to be out of tape in 2 minutes.
Okay.
I do have
Take a
follow-up.
break, because I think Ms. Dinsmore probably has some follow-up good stuff. here.
This
Great.
is the end of tape 1 of the deposition. We'll walk the record at 3:21 p.m.
I just have like